Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Very glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Jim Garrity is away, as you know, and as far as I know, he survived the remnants of Hurricane Debbie down there along the Atlantic coast where he's vacationing. But we're happy to have in his place today Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. She's also host of the High Noon podcast. And Inez, always great to have you.
It's always great to be here. Thanks.
Well, Tim Walz is certainly the talk of the week, and it's not going to stop much today, although we do have one non-Tim Walz story to get to in our third martini as it relates to a recent legal decision involving Google. But let's talk about the big story that's embroiling the campaign right now, and that is Tim Walz's military service. Was in the Army National Guard for, by some accounts, 24 or 25 years. But the contention, of course, is that he up and retired just as he was learning that his unit was likely headed to Iraq. But let's get the whole lead up to what happened here. And let's start with what happened with Walz's rollout speech on Tuesday, where he took a pot shot at J.D. Vance.
Like all regular people I grew up with in the heartland, J.D. studied at Yale, had his career funded by Silicon Valley billionaires, and then wrote a bestseller trashing that community. Come on! That's not what middle America is.
Well, J.D. Vance wasted no time in responding to that yesterday.
I grew up in a poor family. The fact that Tim Walz wants to turn it into a bad thing, that I actually worked myself through college, through law school, and made something myself, to me, that's the American dream. And if Tim Walz wants to insult it, I think that's frankly pretty bizarre.
But he wasn't done. Vance then went on offense about Walz's service and what he did and didn't do.
When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with. I think it's shameful to prepare your unit to go to Iraq, to make a promise that you're going to follow through, and then to drop out right before you actually have to go. I also think it's dishonest. Something, again, if you guys ever get an opportunity to ask Tim Walz or Kamala Harris some questions, he made this interesting comment that the Kamala Harris campaign put out there, and I bet they're regretting they put it out there now, because he said that and he was making a point about gun control, he said we shouldn't allow weapons that I used in war to be on America's streets. Well, I wonder, Tim Walz, when were you ever in war? What was this weapon that you carried into war, given that you abandoned your unit right before they went to Iraq, and he has not spent a day in a combat zone?
And just to be clear, on that point, Vance is right. It was Kamala Harris who put out this video where Walz is talking about the need for more gun control and says that he carried certain weapons in war.
I spent 25 years in the Army and I hunt. And I gave the money back, and I'll tell you what I have been doing. I've been voting for common sense legislation that protects the Second Amendment, but we can do background checks. We can do CDC research. We can make sure we don't have reciprocal carry among states, and we can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war is the only place where those weapons are at.
So, and as a lot of different aspects of this, there seems to be some dispute in terms of Walz's retirement. Some say he got out when he found out his unit was headed to Iraq. Others say it was a couple months before, but it's possible he knew that it was likely. There's the fight over whether he deserves to call himself a command sergeant major. I think the indisputable one here is saying that he carried weapons of war while he was in war when it's obvious he was never in a combat zone. So how big of a deal is this? The campaign has admitted that he used loose language in describing being at war there. I assume if J.D. Vance had done that, this would be the scandal of the century. But how far do you think this goes?
Right. That's an interesting question, given that we know the media imbalance, right, that is going to fall on everything that J.D. Vance said, even well before he was in the running for VP, is going to be scrutinized with a magnifying glass. And we know that this story, even though it was out there in news, it apparently came up in Walz's campaign for Congress. And by the way, to me, almost the most disturbing aspect of this story is there have been a number of stories that have now been gone back and stealth edited. Right, so there's a Bloomberg story that has in the story a line about Walz deploying to Iraq, which he never did. He was in Italy, right? That was his deployment, was 6 months in Italy. That story has now been changed to say Italy. So, I mean, that's really kind of a Pravda-esque nature of our media now. And that's really the question. When you ask how deep or how important is this story, Well, it depends how much J.D. Vance is able to make it an issue. And Trump, the principal, right at the top of the ticket, is able to make it an issue. So far, I mean, I think the fact that we're talking about it at all is actually a testament to the fact that J.D. Vance has done a good job on the campaign trail. He has been aggressive. He has hit back against both Kamala Harris and now his counterpoint in VP Walz, running for VP Walz, right? So I think he has actually shown himself to be very effective on the trail. And I know there's been a lot of chatter about whether J.D. Vance was the right pick. And the first round of the media sort of coverage was all about the childless cat lady stuff, which I was on his side about. But I'm just, doubtless that's not probably how you want to open up your case to the American people, right? But when I look at actually what he's done on the campaign trail, he has been clever. He's, talked eloquently about his story. I think that answer that he gave to Walz about, his childhood and then coming up out of that and going to an Ivy League law school, right? I think that's an answer that a lot of people are going to admire. I think there is a lot to admire in his biography. And then coming back and hitting him with this story, which we're now talking about. I think J.D. Vance is proving himself quite effective.
And so when it comes to how the Democrats deal with this, there are some rumors that they're already worried about whether Walz is a drag on the ticket now. Neither one of them talks to the media. There's some reports from Politico that Kamala's chatty on the plane, but it's all off the record, so the media is happy, and the public never gets some, Kamala FaceTime having to address some serious questions about her role in the Biden administration and everything else, her flip-flop on major positions that were much further left back when she was running in 2020. So is the media just going to sit there all happy to chat her up on the plane and kind of work it into their stories anonymously? Or do we actually have some building pressure to get both of these people on the record fairly soon?
I think the only way that's going to happen is if Trump and J.D. Vance make it happen, right? That is the one counterpoint that they have to the general coverage of the media. The media is going to do everything they can to drag Kamala Harris across the finish line. And I think that would be true for any Democratic candidate. We saw how they turned on Joe Biden because there was internal division in the Democratic Party. I guess one of the things I disagree with quite a few of the people I've seen making this point, I think that if they had decided to stick with Joe Biden, we would have seen a totally shameless turnaround on the part of the media. They would have pumped out the narrative and we would have seen this race tighten up either way. One, because it's a divided country, and two, because the media would be so determined to sort of uniformly push out the Democratic narrative. So if these kinds of stories, negative stories or hits or even answers to some of what the Democratic ticket is saying about the Republican ticket are going to make it into the mainstream consciousness, it's going to be because Trump and J.D. Vance made that happen. They stayed on message. They constantly respond. I mean, J.D. Vance has been hammering not just the service record, but the fact that they haven't answered questions, right? The fact that Kamala Harris hasn't sat down with media. He went over to the press scrum on the side of the plane and kind of gave her, kind of made fun of her a little bit for not talking to media, right? To the extent that any of these things are going to matter and actually penetrate into the consciousness of someone who's not constantly watching things about the presidential race, it's going to be the principals themselves who are going to have to make it happen, because we know that it's not going to happen spontaneously from the media. And by the way, this is why I think that there's a lot of chatter about whether or not debates actually are important in modern races, right? We've kind of replaced, in many ways, the utility of a debate, say, in 1950 with this 24-hour news cycle. But I think they have a new utility now, which is that may be the only time we get Democratic candidates on the record, unmediated, talking to the American people, because the media is clearly going to allow her to run as much as is humanly possible a 2020-style basement campaign, and where she just doesn't open her mouth in front of people. And frankly, if I were them, I would do that too.
Well, it's a 3.5-month sprint instead of almost 2 years in this situation, so they have a better chance of getting away with it. In terms of the Democratic response, first of all, like I said, they're saying, oh, Walz just wasn't specific enough with his language. I think it was plenty specific. But their other defense is, well, Trump didn't even serve at all. He didn't serve in Vietnam. Bone spurs. Is that effective, do you think? Or is that just trying to distract from the controversy?
I mean, stolen valor is a different, whether or not this applies, and the arguments about whether it applies or not, stolen valor is a different critique than not serving. And I think this is interesting, like the resurgence of these wars about the military records, these political back and forth about military records. It shows that we've been at war for the last 20 years, right? Because even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this kind of disappeared, especially with Bill Clinton, right? He was the first in a long time to have no military service record. George W. Bush had a military service record, which Dan Rather lied about, but it wasn't, a particularly gallant military service record. I mean, he was in the military, but he wasn't in combat. Now we have a generation of politicians who, a lot of them have served in active combat. J.D. Vance was in a combat zone. I'm sure we'll hear some more back and forth about exactly what he did there as a Marine. But I don't know how much this really. I don't think it's going to define the campaign. I do think that if people get the impression that this very aggressive PR image of Walz as the steady everyman from the Midwest and this kind of vibe around Walz, that he's Coach Walz and he served in the military, if that starts to feel fake and inaccurate about him, I think that this story could be a piece of that larger impression that really would sink his one I think the reason that ultimately that he ended up on the ticket, right, which is to give those vibes or that vibe of normalcy that is actually the appeal for putting him on the ticket. If that bubble gets burst by this story and maybe a couple others, the gap between the far left policies that he's pursued and this, I mean, all the media was using this exact phrase, right, folksy demeanor. It was almost like David Harsiani has a great sort of compilation of all the media outlets in sync with each other is talking about Walz's folksy demeanor. When that starts to ring false, whether it's through this story or through, several other stories about his policies, I think that really could harm the ticket, could harm Walz's image, and ultimately could cost that ticket votes.
And it's only day 3 of this campaign, so we'll see what's coming next. All right, Inez, on to our second martini, our bad martini, and this is Tim Walz again. The context is a little unclear here, so we were a little bit hesitant to do this, but then we decided there's no real good defense for what we do here in this clip. We do know that over time, of course, that certain comments have not been favored by the administration, and the government, whether it was the FBI or Homeland Security, was getting in touch with social media companies, including Twitter, prior to the Elon Musk era, saying, "Oh no, we don't like this. We need that to be throttled and not get as much exposure. Or maybe that account needs to be suspended. Can you guys work on that?" And for the most part, they dutifully did. But here's Tim Walz. This is on MSNBC, and he's simply talking about what he doesn't think free speech includes.
There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
There's no free speech guarantee on what he considers misinformation or hate speech or what is a threat to democracy. And so we saw this with thoughts on COVID. That got throttled, certainly in reaction to the 2020 election. Those sorts of things all had warning labels on them and other community notes or whatever passed for a community note back then. The idea, Inez, that being wrong or even being intentionally wrong is somehow not covered by the First Amendment, as odious as it might be. The First Amendment is generally designed to protect the speech you hate the most, to make sure that the speech you like doesn't get killed. So is there a way that comment right there makes any constitutional sense? No.
I mean, that's the short answer, right? There is no category of hate speech. I know that it's a political category that we talk about. It's certainly a category in other countries that we think of as relatively free. But the U.S. is alone. So like in the U.K., there is such a thing as legal hate speech, right? In France. But in the United States, hate speech is a protected category of speech. That's leaving aside, of course, the principal problem with thinking about speech this way, which is that the categories of misinformation or hate speech are totally, it's impossible to come up with a non-ideological or neutral definition of those concepts, right? The ideological perspective is built in. And this is really, I think, something that's very common with the way the left thinks not only about free speech, but about everything these days, which is that the assumptions, the underlying assumptions of the left are considered neutral or apolitical or somehow above the fray. Whereas when conservatives or people on the right engage and argue back against some of those ideas, that's considered the political, the ideological, the biased, right? There's this veneer of objectivity. Well, that's just building in your assumptions and kind of in a way that in the worst case is dishonest, but in the less bad case is just sort of like a shortcut, right, among people who all agree with the same assumptions underlying. And that's so much of what we see here. There is no principal distinction that I've never seen anyone draw, and I don't believe it's possible to draw, between misinformation and ideological disagreement.
No, that's very well said. And that's, I think, what the left is after. It's always in defense of some noble principle. In this case, in this clip, it's protecting our democracy, or in terms of COVID information, it's protecting our public health and the greater good and so forth. And so not only do you have a constitutional right to be wrong, you also have a constitutional right to be an idiot, which is good for the social media companies, because if that speech wasn't allowed, they'd pretty much all go bankrupt tomorrow. But any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, and this is an aside in some way, but we protect false speech, even intentionally false speech, again, in a way that some of our sister sort of Western democracies, liberal democracies, do not, right? We protect false speech, even intentionally false speech. The bar for defamation is very, very high in the United States. Our regime, or at least originally, right, our First Amendment, the way the First Amendment was conceived of, and the principles that underlie it, it's not that we protect it because there's no way to determine at all, right? Or whether that false speech has some value to the discourse. It actually, I think if you look back at the founders, they would all agree like false speech doesn't have a lot of value. What they were worried about is exactly that problem of how do you determine in a neutral way what is false, and that's why false speech is protected. It's incidental, right? The purpose of free speech in the United States is for us to engage as citizens and try to find the truth. And so that is the ideal that we're striving for. But false speech is protected because we don't want the government sitting in ideological judgment of making that call, because it's impossible to make in a way that is non-ideological, that doesn't come down on a particular side. So that's exactly the purpose underlying our very, very broad free speech regime. And as a final sort of dot on all of that, I think it's pretty difficult to argue that Madison wasn't correct in the back and forth, right, about the Bill of Rights at this point, right? That the Bill of Rights has actually, yes, on some the anti-federalists and some of the people who thought that the Bill of Rights, the Federalists, thought the Bill of Rights would become islands of freedom. They have become islands of explicit freedom in a sea of the government expansion around them. But I cannot imagine how much worse it would be right now without the extraordinarily broad protections of the First Amendment that are written down in a way that secures that island. We wouldn't be in a better position without it, is all I'm saying. I think Madison pretty decisively wins that battle from 250 years ago, in my view.
Oh, I mean, the genius of the founders is constantly on display, but it's constantly on display around us in the headlines right now. You got the gun grabbers up in Canada and folks up there lamenting that they don't have a Second Amendment like we do that prevents the government from just doing that. And then I think you mentioned it in passing there that the UK right now, if you start repeating or stating things that they think are insulting, you can be brought in on charges for that in the country that, gave us the Magna Carta a little over 800 years ago. So it's special what we have, and we are very, very grateful for it. Well, if you're a Democratic operative who was hoping for a really smooth rollout of the Tim Walz vice presidential bid, or you are more than a little concerned about what the left really thinks about free speech, you might be interested in having an adult beverage. But before you do that, take ZBiotics, the pre-alcohol probiotic drink that is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut, and it's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break the byproduct down. So just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you will feel your best the next day. And I've seen this happen with actual real live people. They have taken ZBiotics and they felt much better the next morning compared to what they would have felt like otherwise. So go to zbiotics.com/3ml to get 15% off your first order when you use 3ml at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantees, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Visit zbiotics.com/3ml and use the code 3ml at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, ZBiotics, for sponsoring this episode and our good times. All right, and as we talked about big tech there a little bit in the free speech discussion, but let's talk about big tech a little more specifically now, and in particular, a federal court ruling as it pertains to Google. This is AP from a couple days ago. A judge on Monday ruled that Google's ubiquitous search engine has been illegally exploiting its dominance to squash competition and stifle innovation, a seismic decision that could shake up the internet and hobble one of the world's best-known companies. The highly anticipated decision issued by U.S. District Judge Amit Mehta comes nearly a year after the start of a trial pitting the U.S. Justice Department against Google in the country's biggest antitrust showdown in a quarter century. Judge Mehta says, quote, after having carefully considered and weighed the witness testimony and evidence, the court reaches the following conclusion. Google is monopolist, and it has acted as one to maintain its monopoly. He said Google's dominance in the search market is evidence of its monopoly, saying that Google enjoys an 89.2% share of the market for general search services, which increases to nearly 95% on mobile devices. And Google just says in response, this decision recognizes that Google offers the best search engine, but concludes that we shouldn't be allowed to make it easily available. And as those of us able to remember the Microsoft antitrust case from about a quarter century ago, a little bit of a tension here, because I think in a lot of ways Google does play favorites in ideological ways on their search engine and in other ways on their platform. On the other hand, of course, you don't want the government getting involved too much on these things. So where do you come down?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the Microsoft case. I was a kid when that was happening, but I remember it because I grew up in Silicon Valley. So it was like this huge issue that I actually remember even as a small kid seeing in all the headlines and stuff. There are some similarities there. A large parts of this case are about default installments, right? Especially on smartphones, locking out competition in that way. A lot of that stuff was related, right, in Microsoft, pre-installing its browser, and then exclusionary agreements, right, that prevent competitors from edging in on that market. So this is not exactly what we think of as free competition. Of course, it is blurry, as you say. Like theoretically, like a company should be free to contract with other companies and to have an exclusive contract with company. But if you look at it overall, and I think the court does look at this overall and say, no, there's a lot of things keeping your 95% market share that aren't just Google is the best company. I think when Google came out initially as a search engine, it was very clearly the best search engine. I mean, if you compared the results that Google would return, they would be much more effective, much more what you were looking for than any of their competitors. That's just not true anymore. And it's not true in the sort of technical and competency sense, where I don't know about you, but recently, like even laying aside the political stuff that I'll get to in a moment, it's often really difficult to get you have to have really precise search terms to catch what you want. There's half a page of ads, first of all, of ad results that come up first. And then often the thing you're actually looking for is on page 2 or 3, not on the first page. Whereas actually, alternatives like Bing or DuckDuckGo, they're not that much better, but oftentimes I'm now finding that it's easier to find what I'm looking for on one of those alternative search engines, which was not the case even 3 or 4 years ago, right? Because my father-in-law, full disclosure, has been trying to get us to use DuckDuckGo forever because for political reasons, just boycott Google, right? And I have not been able to go along with it because I just found their results just not functional, right? And that's changing because Google is now so much less functional. I don't know how much DuckDuckGo has improved, but Google is now so dysfunctional at returning what you're looking for. That being said, obviously there's a political dimension to this because you're not just talking about a monopoly on grain supply, right? You're talking about a monopoly on information and how the primary way that people find information about politics and everything else. And that does have very clear political implications. And it's obviously used politically by Google. The most infamous example most recently is trying to find information about the Trump assassination attempt, right? Where it was pulling up, if you type in assassination attempt TR, you get Truman. Right?
Yes.
Like that's what's popping up to the top of the Google results. And they're questioned about that in Congress by Republicans in a hearing. And they said, oh, that's our filter that wasn't working correctly about political violence, right? Just very unbelievable sort of answers. And so, yeah, this matters very much for what media results come up. It has hurt non-mainstream media outlets a lot. As anybody who's worked in the news business knows, it's very, very difficult to get a story, say, from National Review to the top few instances or the top few hits of any like sort of topic search. And forget about the news tab, right? The news tab is all just MSNBC and CNN, right? So I think this may have quite a big impact on the way that Americans search for and receive their news. And I think that would be a good thing.
They vowed to appeal, so we'll see how long it takes and where it goes from here. But yeah, anybody who's dealt with Google search engines looking for a non-mainstream news source knows that frustration. And the Trump assassination search, it just reminds me of media getting the story wrong, which could honestly happen. But it's always curious that it always happens in the same direction about getting facts wrong, or in this case, oh, Trump, that probably should have come up. It was just an honest glitch.
It's a little bit like getting overcharged at the grocery store. Somehow you never get undercharged.
Yes.
Mistakes are always going in one direction.
That's exactly it. Inez, thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me again.
Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. She's the host of the High Noon podcast. And for Jim Garrity today, I'm Greg Corumbus of Radio America. Thanks for being with us. And thanks for subscribing to the podcast. And if you haven't, please do that. Tell your friends to do it as well. Thanks for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us all on X. Inez is at Inez Felcher. Jim is at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great Thursday, and please join us again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.